So this is us. I am Frédéric Pirenne. I'm one of the founders of a search tool for marketeers called My Telescope that is specialized as well in a new metric that exists, which is share of search.
And I'm titled as a practitioner, which means that I work with advertising and communication. Have done that for 40 plus years in Sweden and the US. I was in New York for 10 years and ran 2 small agencies. Always been fascinated to see if there are any metrics, any way we can prove to our clients that what we do together actually works and gives them good commercial effect. So that's why I'm also happy to be here today and talk about share research, which I think delivers on that expectation. So let's get right into it. We have only a little bit less than half an hour. Fred, can't you, since you are deep into this from a knowledge and product perspective, can't you describe what share of search really is? Just the 60-second elevator pitch.
Yeah, I think share of search is very much looking into how much more interest and mental space do we create, that mental availability create versus our competitors. It's very clear that what people do when they start getting interested in it, in something, when you capture their interest, is that they want to find out more. Previously, we would talk to friends or family and do other things, and now we search. That's the first thing that we do. But then, of course, in order to know, if we say, okay, this many people are looking for us, searching for us, actively searching for us, is that good or is that bad? We need to compare it to something. And that comparative measure of looking, how are we doing in creating interest and demand versus our competitors, that's share of search.
And do you find, Fred, that this is more accurate than asking people what they think and what they plan to do?
I definitely think that it is, yes, because I mean, there's nothing closer to finding what people have on their mind at that moment than looking into what they write into the search bar of Google or any other search tool. And that's proven because share of search actually has a proven correlation. It's one of the few marketing metrics, in my opinion, that has a proven correlation to changes in market share, meaning that if you improve your share of search, you improve your market share. And then there's a whole bunch of misconceptions about that, a whole bunch of prejudice about it, because it's a relatively new metric. So that would be not surprising. And that's what we would like to talk about as well today.
Okay, great. There's one I often get when I talk about share of search. I often hear colleagues and people talk about share of voice. Mm-hmm. And isn't that already something that we have? And why is this more valid or more accurate?
Yeah. So one of the common misconceptions is that share of search and share of voice are similar, or that one needs to replace the other. And I often then think that it is. It's not. It's not that they're different. I think they're actually very complementary, right? Share of voice is very much the input that you give. Share of voice is how much money are we spending in making our voice being heard. Share of search is very much looking at the output. It's okay, how many people heard us and how many people will then actively go and search for us, right? And making that difference. So what we know as well is that share of voice leads to increased share of search. And here you can see some of the categories where we've investigated that as well. So that if there's an extra 10% of share of voice, there's marginal increases in share of search, which means, as always, that you have to talk to people often and repeat for them to remember and then start actively searching for you, right? But so I think they're very complementary, those two elements. One is the input and the other one is the output.
With this, Fred, doesn't always a big spender with a big budget trump the smaller guys?
You'd think so. And in general, I would think that you're right. But obviously, there's the exceptions that confirm the rules. So I also think that when you have these two together, it could definitely show the level of creativity and the level of impact your campaign is really making. Because if you have a higher share of search based on a lower share of voice, it means that you might be heard less, but what you're saying is much more impactful. So that's definitely a way to show effectiveness and creativity of your campaigns. And that's why I think they marry each other quite well. So if you have the budget for covering, because share of voice is coming from media agencies, if you have the budget to have both and put them next to each other, it can definitely say a lot about the creativity of the agencies you're working with.
Yeah, well, that's encouraging. So it doesn't mean that the big budget always wins. The bigger budget can speak with a louder voice, but doesn't necessarily be heard as well as the smaller, smarter voice.
Exactly. It's very much about not about how hard you scream, but what you're saying, right?
Right.
And the way you say it. So I think that's very, very good.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, and that's another common misconception there is, I talked about the media agencies, but there's also another common misconception where people always say, oh, but share of search, we have search, we have SEO and we have SEM optimization. So a lot of people, when you start talking about share of search, especially internally in organizations, they go like, ah, yes, our digital guy, he knows all about it. But share of search is actually the step that comes before your SEO and SEM. It's the step that talks about what people fill out in the search field. And then you're going to see whether your SEO and SEM is optimized for your pages to get all the way on the top. So we sometimes also internally call it the metric for the pre-performance marketing, right? What do you do before the steps that you can measure in your SEO, your SEM, and everything that comes into your Google Analytics? Everything you do offline as well. How much interest do you create and people actively looking for you? And then, of course, you have to make sure that your SEO and SEM is there. So when I was discussing this with another client recently, I said, it would be interesting to see how many people, what your search volume is, and then in your Google Analytics to see how many people come in from paid, how many people come in from organic, to then see how effective your SEO and SEM actually is.
Mm. Oh, that's good. It's easy when the words and the metrics are similar to get them mixed up. I think you using this, and you mentioned the digital specialists at the agency side. Who would you say, and I'm not sure this is something you wanted to address today, but who would you say on the agency side or on the client side has best use of share of search?
Oh, I think that's a very good question. There's three people I think who can definitely use this. I mean, one of them are the brand managers, because they can see brand strength over a longer period of time. The second one are the people who work with campaigns, either to measure a campaign or to look at the input of a campaign. And the third one is actually the people who work with consumer insight to see what is happening in the world, what are people thinking of. And just to give you a very quick example of that, let me just go into our tool that we have, which also captures a little bit on the share of search part for SEO and SEM. This is a search that we've done within our tool about vacuum cleaners in the UK, right? Dyson, which is a very well-known brand, Miele, Shark, Hoover, Vax. Within just putting here the actual word, we take up all the keywords that come with it, and even branded keywords and also unbranded keywords. So you can actually start seeing that, okay, what are all the different keywords that are coming in here? And just by looking at that, you could be able to optimize on one hand your SEO and your SEM, making sure that you're buying the right keywords, because you can also see what are people talking about when I look at my competitors. But also very much when you make campaigns, being one of the three people you talk about, what could be potential, content for next campaigns that I can do. If we look at Dyson, for example, here, there's animal, there's pet hair. We see that within, the largest parts, animal and so forth is coming back. So there's a lot of pet owners who obviously are looking for a very good vacuum cleaner. So then it could be beneficial to make sure that your next campaign or your next content is pushing specifically that. And that's one example, I think, of how people internally could use it.
That is great. And you made a point really when you look at Dyson and you compare it to the other brands that you have the same search words like Dyson vacuum, Miele vacuum, etc.
Yeah, yeah,
Since Miele also make a lot of kitchenware.
exactly, exactly. I mean, and that's again, share of search is a comparative measure, right? So you need to compare apples with apples. You need to make sure that you compare the right things. So yeah, so that's a very important part right there. But I mean, there's a whole bunch of misconceptions, and I'll let me continue on that, because I talk about Dyson, we talk about Miele, and so forth. But one of the other misconceptions is very much people saying, isn't it just Google Trends? Can I get it from Google Trends? And actually, yes, on a high level, I would think you can get it from Google Trends. But if you really want to look at it in comparison to your market share and your sales and how you're doing, Google Trends isn't the best. So it depends on how you want to use your share of search and what you want to look at for, right? And in order to do that, you have to know how Google Trends works. And it works with indexes. And once you have the indexes, it's not the same as search volume, because your index can say, oh, you're increasing by 600. But that might be from from a very low number to something else. But also here, when you look at this chart, which I've made for PepsiCo and Coca-Cola just in Google Trends, this spike becomes the new 100. So for Coca-Cola, all of these had certain values, and then this spike makes sure that all of these trends change. So if you then want to do a correlation in the end, these values change the entire time, and that makes it very, very difficult. Whereas if you work with search volume, like our tool actually brings, then you can have much more robust numbers to know that if I'm increasing in share of search, am I increasing in market share?
When you see these spikes, you might think that PepsiCo or Coca-Cola started to give away the beverages for free or something. Is this a love fest going on, or what has happened here, Fred?
I'm very glad you asked, because that actually gives a nice segue into another point that share of search often gets as a misconception, is that they say, oh, share of search doesn't work because you could have a crisis on your hands, right? And coincidentally, both these brands within this period of time that I have here had two crises. So the first one, Pepsi, here the blue one, was in actually it's a bit of a while ago now. It was in April 2020, in April 2017 actually, when they released this commercial with Kendall Jenner during the Black Lives Matter movement, to go up to a cop during a demonstration, just have a Pepsi, right? And then the whole world would fall in love with each other again. They got a massive backlash for that, so I had to pull the commercial, and that's basically the spike, right? Now here, and this is coincidentally again in April. It seems to be a very bad month for soft drink companies. This was April 2021, when there was actually a fake news going out for Coca-Cola, where they talked with where there allegedly would have been a presentation together with Joe Biden about cultural reorientation, basically, which was all about how Black History Month and Black history wasn't included in the rest of the history in the U.S. And it turned out to be false news, but it was very, very much searched for. So people say, okay, if you have a crisis, then your share of search will spike, and then it doesn't work. And that's where one other misconception is that your share of search and your market share, they're not one-on-one following each other, and they don't have the short lag. So it's not like we have a crisis tomorrow and then all of our market share will go down, or it's not like I fall in share of search, so I'll see a huge drop in market share the following day. if you look at it short term, like here, right, that's when you can see, okay, is a campaign working well or not? If you look at it long term, that's when you can see, is my brand building, yes or no, and will that increase my market share, yes or no? And if we go back to our tool, and I'm just going to take the liberty to do that and go back to the, I'm now looking into the dashboard that we've made, right? If you look at the share of search, and we look at that in the graph over the last year, then you can see, okay, here there's been an increase in this month. Now it could have been that they, and this is in Dyson, either released a new product or they did a promotion, and that goes up. But it's the total trend that actually looks at, is this market share going better, yes or no? The second thing, and that's the good thing about our tool versus if you use other tools or Google Trends, is that we actually capture both the market share and the sentiment. And how we do that is that we look at the share of search as such, the trends that you have in your search volumes, and then we look at the other hand at the sentiment that we get, and then we combine them and see what happens.
That's great. It's really encouraging to see that you can clean up the data like that, so you don't get misled by mishaps.
No, exactly. And if we continue on our example here, I mean, what we see here is that especially vacuum cleaners, and I think one of our guests, Andrew, is from the UK, so he would be able to confirm that at a later stage. They are getting a lot of increase because they're also doing commercials, so they have an increased share of voice, and then that also leads to an increased share of search. But also they seemingly do a good job because people talk more positively about them, and that's why they're, if we look at the sentiment and search trend, they're doing well and they're going up. So if they can sustain that movement like they've been doing here over the last year, then they will be taking market share from the bigger players such as Dyson or Miele, for example. And I mean, those are just some of the common misconceptions that people have. So if we think about it, it's very much, share of search, checking the output of your marketing and complementing very nice with search of share of voice, that you can measure this part of performance marketing, which I think is quite important, especially for non or digital agencies who also have non-digital parts, like traditional advertising agencies or some media agencies. They can really look at, okay, how do I measure the impact of everything before people come to my website? And we see that those are also the parts that are struggling to getting budgets or to explaining to their CFOs, this is why you should invest in brands, right? And then of course also that we have to think about, okay, the sentiment, you have to think about the intention that goes with it, and that it's a longer term that needs to play, right? I think those are some of the common misconceptions that people have.
Great, but there are so many other issues and questions, and I think you have a plan, Fredrik, to see when and how we can address those.
Yes, and by the way, I mean, feel free to ask questions. We continue to forget that. I think Betty already did, but there are more questions, so we're also going to cover them within the next couple of weeks, because when we talk about share of search, a lot of people ask, okay, what is the minimum amount of searches I need to have a good volume? Or, okay, share of search only works for B2C, because a lot of people seem to think that B2B people don't search online before they make a purchase. How do the correlations really work? Because there's a lot of agencies out there and a lot of people who are trying to do this with Google Trends, but as we said, Google Trends hardly ever gives any really good results, unless if you take very long time series. I mean, I know that Les, he created the initial share of search, also very much working with Google Trends, but he had especially also data that went back 13 years and then making long rolling averages and so forth. And then it works if you have extremely long time series. but then you have to make sure that the data also hasn't been changed. And a lot of companies have a tendency of changing the way of reporting every X amount of years. So that might make it a bit tricky. So in the shorter term, we mean a couple of years, then volumes is the way to go, and when you correlate. And then when people ask, okay, you know, do we have correlations? And the question always comes like, yeah, that works maybe for that industry or this industry, but does it really work for my industry, right?
Right.
And that's a question that we get. And then a question that you asked as well earlier today is how do we implement share search? What do we do with it? Who's responsible for it? How do you use it? And those are questions that we will be exploring more and explaining in the next couple of weeks, with an interval of every other week, in 30 minutes. So we hope to stick to these kind of time schedules that we're doing now, and that people can then also look at these videos at a later stage and, you know, ask more questions so that we can continue to fill up the series of webinars.
And I think you mentioned before, Fred, that there is an opportunity to try my telescope for free, right?
Yes. Yeah. If you just go to mytelescope.io, you can just sign up for a free trial that lasts for 30 days. And if you subscribe there, you can start playing around. And then the one advice I give, because a lot of people then think, okay, how do I work with this? How do I interpret this? It's just like a search tool. Type in whatever you think you want to search, look at the keywords. If you can't find what you want, just refine the top, do it again, click and analyze, and within a matter of minutes, you'll get your search volumes, your share of search of what you want to compare to, the keywords that you can get, and a whole bunch of stuff. So play around, and if you can't find what you want, there's a lot of ways inside the tool that you can get in touch with people, including myself, to reach out and ask for questions.
That sounds good. Betty, Andrew, any other questions you might have before we conclude? Okay,
right.
Good. Thank you, Betty, and thank you, Andrew, for attending. And we hope to see you in 2 weeks, if not sooner. Come back for more.
Absolutely. You have a good day.
All right.